Welcome back. When you think of BTS, you picture unbreakable unity and an unstoppable fandom. But what happens when the biggest group in the world makes choices so unexpected that even their most loyal fans didn't know how to react? What sparks the wildest debates inside a fandom built on absolute devotion? Did they go too far, or were they simply evolving as artists? Buckle up, because we are diving into the untold drama and shocking turning points. Here are 7 BTS decisions that split ARMY down the middle. Are you ready to face the truth? Let's get into it.
Number 7. Jungkook, the explicit rebellion. Picture this. It is the blistering summer of 2023, and the air in the global pop music scene is thick with an almost suffocating anticipation, because the youngest member of the biggest boy band on the planet is finally about to make his highly awaited official solo debut. But what absolutely nobody expects is that this monumental drop is going to unleash a seismic shockwave that will literally fracture the deeply united ARMY fandom into 2 fiercely vocal warring camps. For a solid decade, Jungkook was universally adored and heavily shielded as the ultimate golden maknae, a title that served as both a massive blessing that highlighted his unparalleled prodigal talents and a deeply suffocating curse, because when you debut in the hypercritical K-pop industry at the incredibly tender and vulnerable age of 15, the world essentially freezes you in time, treating you as the eternal younger brother, the sweet, innocent boy with the big doe eyes who must be fiercely protected at all costs from the harsh, corrupting realities of the adult world. However, as the bittersweet Chapter 2 of BTS officially commenced following that notoriously tearful and emotionally devastating Festa dinner in June of 2022, Jungkook made a stunningly conscious, deliberate, and fiercely unapologetic decision to shatter that pristine, suffocating glass box once and for all, paving his own rebellious path with the release of his record-breaking English-language debut single, 7, featuring the bold American rapper Lotto, a track that didn't just push the traditional K-pop envelope, but completely doused it in gasoline and set it on fire by including a highly controversial explicit version that left millions of fans clutching their pearls and staring at their glowing screens in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. When the clock finally struck midnight and the highly anticipated track hit global streaming platforms, the internet timeline instantly erupted into absolute unprecedented chaos as the sweet, romantic, and radio-friendly "Loving You Right" of the clean version was aggressively and unexpectedly replaced by the raw, unfiltered, and deeply provocative "Fucking You Right" in the explicit cut, instantly igniting a blazing, highly emotional civil war within the tight-knit ARMY community that nobody saw coming. On one side of the chaotic digital battlefield, you had the more traditional, conservative fans, many of whom had loyally followed his every move since his awkward teenage years, feeling a profound, almost personal sense of whiplash and betrayal, loudly arguing across forums that the lyrics were unnecessarily crude, far too westernized, and a shocking, drastic departure from the deeply poetic, socially conscious, and meticulously crafted lyricism that BTS had famously built their legendary, untouchable legacy upon, with some panic-stricken fans even launching massive online campaigns claiming that the evil Western music industry and his new management were forcing a hypersexualized, artificial image onto him purely for the sake of cheap, mainstream Western validation and radio play. But on the exact opposite side of this intense divide, an equally passionate, incredibly vocal, and fiercely protective legion of progressive fans rallied tightly behind him, loudly cheering for his long-overdue personal liberation and aggressively pointing out the glaring, uncomfortable hypocrisy of a fandom that constantly demanded artistic growth and independence, yet violently recoiled in horror when a fully grown, 25-year-old millionaire dared to sing about very normal adult themes, sparking intense, emotionally exhausting, and highly philosophical debates across Twitter, TikTok and Weavers about the deeply rooted, highly toxic infantilization of K-pop idols and the dangerous sense of ownership that parasocial fans often feel over their favorite, heavily monitored stars. What makes this entire explosive situation incredibly fascinating and profoundly emotionally charged is not just the sheer magnitude of the controversy itself, but exactly how Jungkook chose to handle the intense, suffocating backlash with a level of cold maturity and defiant rock star confidence that definitively proved he was no longer the painfully shy kid from Busan who used to wait until his older members fell asleep to take a shower in peace. Instead of backing down, issuing a forced corporate apology, or quietly sweeping the explicit version under the rug to immediately appease the angry boycotting mob, he took the narrative directly into his own heavily tattooed hands, logging on to his famous late-night Weavers live streams while casually sipping on highballs, looking right into the camera lens with a relaxed, almost daring smirk, and firmly, politely reminded the entire world that he is, in fact, a grown man, poignantly asking the incredibly valid question of why he shouldn't be allowed to explore mature adult concepts when he is well into his late 20s, a powerful statement that served as both a harsh reality check for delusional fans and an absolute masterclass in setting rigid personal boundaries with a massive, demanding parasocial audience. The drama, however, absolutely did not stop there, because the highly anticipated addition of Latto's raunchy, unapologetic rap verse added even more explosive fuel to the already raging fire, with some conservative fans going as far as actively editing her entire section out of the song and distributing illegal altered audio files online, while the opposite side streamed the explicit version relentlessly and aggressively to prove a massive point, literally turning the prestigious Billboard charts into a digital battleground of conflicting ideologies, where the song eventually, against all odds, debuted squarely at #1 on the fiercely competitive Hot 100, conclusively proving that raw controversy, when perfectly paired with undeniable generational talent and a ridiculously catchy UK garage-inspired beat, is the ultimate unstoppable recipe for total global domination. This monumental decision wasn't just some simple, cheap marketing tactic cooked up in a boardroom or a desperate, edgy plea for mainstream attention. It was a profound psychological and artistic metamorphosis, a deeply necessary and painful growing pain for a fiercely independent artist desperate to shed the suffocating, squeaky clean skin of his past and completely redefine his solo identity entirely on his own terms, effectively forcing the entire rigid K-pop industry to look in the mirror and confront the highly uncomfortable reality that their perfectly manufactured, heavily sanitized idols are real, breathing, complex, and sexual human beings who will inevitably and rightfully outgrow the innocent fantasies sold to the masses. Looking back at the absolute madness of that era, the release of the explicit version of Seven will forever be cemented and remembered as one of the most intensely polarizing, yet brilliantly calculated, boldest moves in modern pop history, a truly defining watershed moment where Jungkook fearlessly gambled his universally loved, meticulously crafted good boy image for a highly intoxicating taste of authentic, unbridled artistic freedom, leaving a permanently deeply divided fandom in his chaotic wake, but ultimately triumphantly emerging from the flames as an untouchable, legendary global pop titan who plays strictly and unapologetically by his own rules, refusing to be caged or defined by the nostalgic, suffocating expectations of millions, and leaving us all breathless, deeply captivated, and intensely wondering just how much further he is willing to push the rigid boundaries of the industry when he inevitably returns to the global stage, completely unapologetic, fiercely independent, and undeniably his own man.
Number 6. RM, the English Era Sacrifice.
Cast your mind back to the terrifying, deeply isolating depths of the global pandemic in the late summer of 2020, a chaotic, unprecedented period where the entire world had essentially grinded to a screeching, agonizing halt, and the global music industry was desperately scrambling to find any semblance of hope, joy, and connection in the heavy, suffocating dark. It was precisely in this tense, unpredictable global vacuum that BTS unleashed a brightly colored, disco-infused, and undeniably infectious cultural phenomenon known as Dynamite, but what initially seemed like a beautifully simple, uplifting, and comforting gift to a hurting, deeply depressed world quickly, almost aggressively, morphed into one of the most intensely polarizing and deeply, fiercely debated artistic shifts in the entire legendary history of the group, placing their brilliant, fiercely intellectual leader RM at the absolute suffocating epicenter of a massive, unprecedented fandom civil war. For 7 consecutive, incredibly hard-fought years, Kim Namjoon had meticulously and passionately served as the philosophical backbone and the profound, poetic soul of BTS, heavily penning deeply introspective, socially conscious, and fiercely critical Korean lyrics that tackled everything from the crushing, toxic pressures of the modern South Korean education system to the complex, agonizing, and universally relatable journey of loving oneself in a hyper-judgmental, unforgiving society, essentially establishing the group not just as mere manufactured pop idols, but as genuinely authentic, incredibly powerful, and relatable voices for a marginalized, deeply misunderstood youth. But the monumental, earth-shattering, and record-breaking chart-topping success of their very first fully English-language track suddenly and violently forced the group down an unexpected, highly lucrative, yet incredibly controversial path, leading directly to the deliberate, calculated release of a full, unabashedly mainstream English pop trilogy that subsequently included the incredibly slick summer anthem Butter and the aggressively cheerful, stadium-ready Permission to Dance, a massive, strategic, and world-conquering corporate decision that instantly, almost brutally fractured the massive ARMY fandom squarely down the middle. On one deeply frustrated, highly vocal side of this intense, emotionally exhausting digital battleground, a very large, incredibly passionate faction of older, deeply dedicated veteran fans began to loudly and aggressively voice their profound disappointment and mounting uncomfortable alienation, passionately arguing across endless fiery social media threads and massive fan forums that the raw, authentic group they had originally fallen deeply in love with was slowly and tragically losing its deeply rooted hip-hop soul, heavily criticizing the new English tracks as overly sanitized, highly repetitive, and painfully generic bubblegum pop that fundamentally and deliberately stripped away the complex, deeply personal, and highly nuanced lyricism that RM and the entire rap line were so globally respected and legendary for. The stark, undeniable reality that caused so much massive friction was that in these massive radio-friendly pop anthems, the legendary BTS rap line, a fiercely powerful, originally underground-rooted trio that had originally and unapologetically defined the group's entire edgy, rebellious underdog identity back in their intense 2013 debut, was essentially reduced to brief, heavily vocal-processed, almost superficial background verses, a glaring, highly uncomfortable sonic shift that only served to pour more explosive gasoline onto the already raging fires of intense fandom debate. These deeply loyal veteran fans felt a heartbreaking, almost personal sense of betrayal, genuinely fearing that the group had finally succumbed to the massive, suffocating, and incredibly toxic pressure of Western industry validation, effectively trading their rich, culturally significant, and incredibly beautiful Korean identity and raw artistic integrity for heavily manufactured radio play, shiny, highly coveted Grammy nominations, and cheap, easily digestible viral TikTok dance challenges. However, on the entirely opposite side of the digital barricades, a massive, rapidly expanding, and fiercely defensive wave of newer fans and incredibly loyal supporters aggressively rallied tightly behind the group, forcefully countering that artists are absolutely allowed to organically evolve, experiment with new sounds, and simply have fun, adamantly defending the massively successful English trilogy as a completely necessary, beautifully timed, and deeply profound beacon of light and pure, unadulterated joy that miraculously brought immense comfort and a reason to smile to literally millions of depressed, isolated, and grieving people worldwide during humanity's absolute darkest, most terrifying hour. Furthermore, they rightfully and aggressively pointed out that this highly strategic, undeniable mainstream push finally decisively shattered the deeply racist, inherently xenophobic glass ceilings of the Western music industry, forcing major American radio stations, massive global brands, and incredibly conservative award shows to finally officially acknowledge the sheer, undeniable, and unstoppable power of 7 talented Korean men. What makes this incredibly divisive, massively successful era so profoundly emotional and utterly heartbreaking in retrospect, however, is not just the intense, exhausting, and highly toxic fandom infighting that plagued social media every single day, but the quiet, agonizing, and deeply profound internal sacrifice of RM himself, who bravely and stoically stood at the very forefront of this massive, well-oiled corporate machine, pasting on a flawless, charming smile through literally hundreds of repetitive, deeply exhausting, and sometimes blatantly disrespectful English interviews, eloquently and passionately defending their new musical direction to foreign journalists, while simultaneously desperately suffocating in silence under the crushing, invisible, and terrifying weight of his own profound artistic identity. Namjoon, a brilliant, highly educated man who once proudly and confidently addressed the United Nations with a deeply moving, philosophically rich speech about speaking yourself and finding your true voice, was now routinely forced to sit under blinding studio lights and answer incredibly mundane, superficial, and painfully shallow questions from clueless Western interviewers about who his favorite celebrity crush was or what his favorite food was, a jarring, deeply uncomfortable, and highly ironic juxtaposition that perfectly and tragically encapsulated the massive, agonizing dual life he was being heavily forced to lead as the bilingual leader of the world's biggest phenomenon. The devastating, deeply sobering truth of this glamorous, history-making, and record-breaking era was finally tragically revealed to the entire stunned world during the infamously raw, tear-soaked, and incredibly difficult 2022 Festa dinner, where a visibly exhausted, emotionally shattered, and deeply vulnerable Namjoon bravely and stoically broke down in front of millions of watching fans, heartbreakingly confessing that after the intense release of On and the subsequent uncontrollable global explosion of Dynamite, he had completely and terrifyingly lost his sense of direction, devastatingly admitting that he genuinely no longer knew what kind of group BTS was, what profound message they represented, or what meaningful story they were even trying to tell the world anymore. He confessed with a raw, agonizing, and deeply poetic vulnerability that completely silenced the internet and broke millions of hearts, that the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the massive K-pop industry and the suffocating, crushing pressure to constantly produce massive, record-breaking global hits had completely and utterly drained him of his artistic essence, leaving him feeling deeply hollow, like a mere mechanical rap-making machine rather than a true, authentic artist with a soul, and that the monumental, earth-shattering, and undeniably history-making success of the English pop trilogy had actually come at the massive, deeply painful, and deeply personal cost of his own creative identity. This incredibly profound, earth-shattering, and deeply honest confession retroactively painted the entire massive English pop trilogy era in a completely different, incredibly melancholy, and deeply heartbreaking light, instantly forcing the entire fractured fandom to
silently hit the brakes, take a long, hard, uncomfortable look in the mirror, and deeply reflect on the enormous, often invisible and deeply scarring psychological toll that absolute, unprecedented global domination inevitably takes on the fragile, real human beings trapped behind the glossy, perfect idol personas. It fundamentally and permanently transformed what many critical fans had cynically and harshly viewed as a shallow, greedy corporate sellout era into a deeply moving, incredibly painful, and highly emotional story of a young, heavily burdened leader willingly sacrificing his own beloved artistic identity, swallowing his immense pride and compromising his poetic genius for the greater, monumental survival and historic success of his beloved team, ultimately cementing RM's deeply conflicted, agonizing decision to spearhead and embrace the English pop compromise as one of the most intensely polarizing, deeply heartbreaking, yet inevitably heroic and massively consequential turning points in the entire legendary and incredibly complex history of BTS.
Number 5. Jin, the enlistment ultimatum. Fast forward your mind to the incredibly tense, painfully drawn-out and fiercely political circus that completely consumed the global music sphere and the South Korean media landscape from the dizzying heights of 2020 all the way to the emotionally devastating twilight of 2022. A chaotic period where the oldest member of the world's biggest boy band, Kim Seok-jin, found himself tragically and unwillingly thrust into the absolute suffocating epicenter of a massive, unprecedented national debate that fiercely fractured the army fandom into two incredibly stressed, highly vocal, and opposing factions. For decades, South Korea's strict, unforgiving mandatory military service has been a deeply sensitive, completely untouchable third rail in their society. But when BTS began generating literally billions of dollars for the national economy, speaking at the United Nations, and achieving impossible, history-making milestones like securing multiple Grammy nominations, a massive, highly controversial debate erupted within the government about whether these 7 extraordinary men deserved a special presidential exemption, sparking an agonizing years-long political tug-of-war that essentially turned Jin's personal life and impending enlistment deadline into a cheap, highly publicized political football. This agonizing, endless uncertainty instantly ignited a massive, incredibly toxic, and deeply emotional civil war within the incredibly diverse army fandom, drawing a stark, incredibly tense dividing line between the passionate international fans and the deeply concerned domestic Korean fans. On one side of this fierce digital battlefield, millions of incredibly vocal, protective international fans, completely baffled by the strict cultural nuances of South Korean duty, launched massive, aggressive online campaigns, loudly trending hashtags, writing millions of desperate emails to government officials, and aggressively arguing that forcing the nation's absolute greatest cultural ambassadors and the undisputed kings of global soft power to halt their unprecedented world-conquering momentum to go march in the freezing dirt was an absurd, completely illogical waste of generational talent and immense economic potential. However, on the exact opposite side of this extremely fragile divide, the deeply anxious, heavily stressed Korean armies were desperately and frantically trying to silence the aggressive international campaigns, acutely aware of the incredibly harsh, deeply unforgiving, and often brutal reality of South Korean public sentiment, fiercely warning that any form of special treatment or drafted exemption would permanently, irreparably destroy the group's carefully built, universally respected, and deeply humble underdog reputation, potentially subjecting all 7 members to a horrifying, inescapable lifetime of vicious public backlash, severe political resentment, and cruel, unrelenting media scrutiny in a country that highly values total equality in military duty above absolutely everything else.
As the politicians shamelessly dragged their feet for years, publicly debating the so-called BTS law just to milk the group's immense global popularity for cheap, easy political clout and highly coveted media headlines, Jin, a deeply private, incredibly selfless, and remarkably stoic individual, was unfairly forced to shoulder the absolute heaviest, most suffocating psychological burden of them all, quietly absorbing thousands of vicious, incredibly cruel and utterly baseless daily hate comments from the aggressive general public who falsely and maliciously accused him of being a cowardly draft dodger, desperately hiding behind his massive fame. What makes this intensely debated, deeply painful era so profoundly heartbreaking is the shocking, incredibly emotional, and deeply guarded truth that Jin finally, bravely revealed to the entire weeping world long after the dust had settled. He had desperately, passionately wanted to enlist way back in the cold winter of 2020, immediately after the release of the deeply comforting BE album, but was repeatedly, agonizingly forced to delay his own deeply personal life plans over and over again for the sake of the massive, unprecedented, and uncontrollable success with the explosive, history-making Dynamite, and later the highly emotional, critically important, and massively publicized World Expo 2030 bid concert in his beloved member's hometown of Busan. During that legendary, highly emotionally charged and incredibly bittersweet yet-to-come concert in October 2022, a devastatingly beautiful purple-hued spectacle that millions of deeply anxious fans intuitively felt in their breaking hearts was a tearful, unstated farewell. Jin stood on that massive stage with a breathtaking, deeply melancholic grace, his usually bright, playful, and wonderfully chaotic demeanor replaced by a quiet, profound, and deeply touching solemnity as he bravely held back a sea of unshed tears, heavily carrying the absolute, soul-crushing weight of a monumental, deeply personal secret that he could not yet legally share with the fiercely adoring, screaming crowd before him. Then, just 2 short, incredibly agonizing days after the final deafening echo of the Busan concert faded into the cool autumn air, big hit music suddenly, completely unexpectedly, and forcefully dropped the absolute mother of all bombshell statements that completely shattered the internet and brought the entire exhausting, years-long political circus to a massive, screeching, and incredibly satisfying halt. Kim Sek-jin had officially, formally submitted the paperwork to cancel his legal enlistment delay, making the bold, deeply courageous, and incredibly profound decision to proudly and willingly serve his country as an active-duty soldier, completely ending the toxic, dividing debate entirely on his own fiercely independent terms. This single massive, profoundly history-altering decision was the ultimate, undisputed mic drop moment that completely silenced the vicious, heavily prejudiced media, deeply humbled the corrupt, clout-chasing politicians, and instantly, beautifully reunited the deeply fractured, highly anxious fandom in a massive, overwhelming, and profoundly emotional wave of absolute, unadulterated pride and deeply respectful awe. He completely refused to be a helpless pawn in a cynical political game, bravely taking the excruciatingly difficult, deeply honorable path that perfectly and forever cemented his legendary legacy, not just as worldwide handsome, with a brilliant silver-voiced vocalist of the world's biggest group, but as a fiercely principled, incredibly strong, and profoundly honorable man of immense, unbreakable character. But as the deeply emotional, tear-soaked footage of his freezing December enlistment finally surfaced, showing his beloved, heavily bundled younger brothers gently rubbing his newly shaved head as he walked bravely into the harsh, biting cold of the intense military training center, it left the entire, deeply reflective world intensely questioning. How many agonizing, deeply sleepless nights did he suffer entirely alone in the suffocating, terrifying dark, bearing the impossible, crushing weight of an entire nation's toxic expectations, just to fiercely protect the pristine, untouchable legacy of his beloved bandmates? And as he willingly, bravely traded his massive, history-making stadiums and blinding, global spotlights for the rigid, fiercely disciplined, and highly isolated life of a frontline soldier, did he finally, truly find the quiet, elusive peace he had been desperately, painfully searching for, far away from the crushing, relentless, and unforgiving demands of absolute global superstardom.
Number 4. J-Hope, the eco-friendly album Sacrifice. Rewind your memory to the intensely uncertain, highly anxiety-ridden summer of 2022, a monumental period when the massive, glittering BTS universe had just officially, tearfully announced their temporary hiatus to pursue individual endeavors, an era officially dubbed Chapter 2, and the absolute unbearable pressure of being the very first member to step out completely alone into the blinding, unforgiving global spotlight fell squarely onto the shoulders of Jungkook, universally known and beloved as J-Hope. For his entire spectacular career, he had been widely celebrated as the radiant, unwavering sunshine of the group, the bright, smiling, and incredibly energetic dance leader who famously produced the vibrant, pop-infused, and deeply comforting Hope World mixtape. But instead of safely delivering more of that easily digestible, cheerful pop perfection, he completely shattered the fandom's comfortable expectations by plunging headfirst into a terrifyingly dark, grunge-heavy, old-school hip-hop concept with his phenomenal debut solo album, Jack in the Box. However, the fiercely intense, deeply philosophical musical shift and the raw, aggressive aesthetics of tracks like More and Arson were absolutely not what caused the massive, highly toxic, and seemingly endless civil war to violently erupt within the massive ARMY fandom. Rather, it was a shockingly unprecedented, deeply controversial, and highly experimental corporate decision regarding the physical release of the album itself that instantly split the fanbase into two fiercely warring, incredibly vocal factions. In a sudden, heavily scrutinized announcement that completely blindsided millions of eager fans who were heavily clutching their wallets and passionately preparing to break massive global sales records, Big Hit Music revealed that Jack in the Box would exclusively be released as a Weverse album, a painfully minimalist, highly experimental format consisting solely of a tiny, flimsy paper box containing a simple QR code and a couple of photo cards, entirely stripping away the traditional, highly coveted shiny CD, the massive, glossy 100-page photo books, the folded posters, and the elaborate, heavy packaging that have historically served as the very lifeblood and foundation of the immensely profitable, fiercely competitive K-pop industry. The massive corporate entity heavily marketed this stark minimalist approach as a noble, deeply necessary, and highly progressive, eco-friendly initiative aimed at violently disrupting the toxic, incredibly wasteful K-pop culture of mass bulk buying that heavily pollutes the earth with millions of discarded, unused plastic albums. But this highly strategic ESG, or environmental, social, and governance explanation immediately ignited a massive, incredibly destructive powder keg of pure, unadulterated outrage across global social media platforms. On one intensely furious, heavily chart-focused side of the digital battlefield, thousands of deeply protective, incredibly passionate fans, particularly solo supporters, erupted into absolute blinding rage, loudly and aggressively accusing the company of blatant, unapologetic sabotage, fiercely arguing that it was fundamentally cruel, immensely disrespectful, and utterly unacceptable to use the very first, highly anticipated BTS solo debut as a risky, disposable corporate guinea pig for a cheap, cost-cutting environmental experiment. They passionately and aggressively pointed out that by completely eliminating traditional physical CDs, the company was essentially and deliberately tanking J-Hope's massive potential on the fiercely competitive global music charts, most notably the prestigious Billboard 200, which heavily relies on traditional physical sales and merchandise bundles for high placements, sparking endless, highly toxic Twitter spaces, massive global trending hashtags, and incredibly bitter online petitions demanding a proper, respectful physical release for an artist who had literally poured his absolute blood, sweat, and tears into crafting a genuine, cohesive, and deeply personal masterpiece.
They felt a profound, deeply agonizing sense of betrayal, painfully questioning why the group's radiant sunshine, a deeply dedicated man who consistently gave his entire soul to his art and his members, was seemingly being treated like a second-class citizen and unfairly denied the deeply emotional, incredibly significant milestone of proudly holding his own beautiful, physically weighty solo album in his hands. However, on the entirely opposite side of this incredibly tense, highly emotional divide, a massive, equally passionate wave of progressive fans and deeply loyal supporters firmly and aggressively rallied to defend both the experimental format and the artist, forcefully arguing that J-Hope himself, a fiercely intelligent, highly involved, and incredibly meticulous visionary who actively participated in every single creative detail of his project, was absolutely completely aware of and fully supportive of this groundbreaking, eco-conscious decision. They loudly and proudly praised him for being incredibly brave, genuinely unselfish, and remarkably forward-thinking, proudly celebrating the undeniable fact that he was willingly sacrificing guaranteed, easily attainable commercial numbers and shiny plastic chart trophies to make a profound, highly impactful statement about the deeply unsustainable, environmentally devastating reality of modern music consumption, aggressively reminding the furious, boycotting fans that true, authentic artistry is fundamentally measured by the raw quality of the music, the depth of the lyrics, and the powerful message it delivers, absolutely not by how many pieces of identical plastic are sitting collecting dust on a teenager's bedroom shelf. The agonizing, completely chaotic friction between these two fiercely opposing ideologies reached an absolute thrilling fever pitch during J-Hope's legendary, history-making headlining set at Lollapalooza in Chicago, affectionately dubbed Hopapalooza, where he dramatically leapt out of a massive life-size box onto the stage and delivered a shockingly intense, incredibly raw, and absolute masterclass in live, unfiltered performance, single-handedly conquering a massive screaming crowd of over 100,000 people with a ferocious rock-infused energy and a spectacular live band that definitively proved he was an untouchable, legendary stage genius who absolutely did not need a piece of physical plastic to validate his immense, undeniable worth or his towering global presence. Yet, the deeply bitter, highly resentful feelings within the deeply divided fandom were violently reignited, completely tearing the emotional wounds wide open again almost a full year later, when the massive company, apparently completely buckling under the relentless, endless fan pressure and the undeniable, incredibly lucrative commercial reality of physical sales, suddenly backtracked on their grand, supposedly unwavering environmental crusade and released a traditional, heavy physical CD version called the Hope Edition, a highly controversial, painfully delayed move that the angry, chart-obsessed fans instantly and aggressively weaponized as absolute, undeniable proof that the original QR code strategy was indeed a massive, completely failed corporate blunder that unfairly and permanently robbed J-Hope of his rightful initial chart glory. Looking back at this intensely polarizing, incredibly stressful, and completely chaotic era, it stands as a massive, profoundly sobering reflection on the complex, highly demanding nature of modern music fandom, completely forcing us to fiercely confront the uncomfortable, deeply nuanced intersection between noble environmental responsibility, intense corporate profit-seeking maneuvering, and the massive and often deeply toxic expectations of measurable commercial success. As we deeply reflect on the incredible, dark, and undeniable brilliance of the Jack-in-the-Box concept and the absolute untamed fire he brilliantly unleashed on that historic Chicago stage, we're left intensely wondering and deeply questioning the real, unfiltered truth hidden behind heavily closed corporate doors. Did Jung Ho-sok willingly, proudly, and independently choose to sacrifice his own massive commercial glory and traditional artistic milestones to bravely pave a noble, incredibly difficult greener path for a deeply flawed industry? Or was he unfairly, quietly manipulated by a massive profit-driven corporation, incredibly eager to test out a risky, highly experimental new format on a beautifully kind-hearted, incredibly loyal member, notoriously known for always putting the greater good of the team above his own personal, well-deserved desires?
Number 3. Suga, the provocative audio sample. Take yourselves back to the incredibly chaotic, deeply unpredictable spring of 2020, a time when the entire globe was completely locked down, heavily isolated, and desperately craving any form of digital escape, which made the completely unannounced, highly anticipated surprise drop of Suga's second massive solo mixtape, D2, under his fierce, unapologetic underground alter ego, August D, feel like a massive, earth-shattering cultural reset for the entire global music community. For years, Min Yoongi had brilliantly and meticulously cultivated this aggressive, completely unfiltered, and intensely raw side persona as a vital, deeply necessary psychological outlet, a dark, heavy, and completely uncensored sonic sanctuary where he could violently tear away the glossy, highly sanitized, and perfectly packaged idol image of BTS to violently spit venom at his harsh critics, brutally dissect his own deeply terrifying mental health struggles, and aggressively tackle incredibly taboo societal issues that were deemed far too risky for the massive mainstream corporate boy band brand. The absolute brilliance of D2 was instantly celebrated worldwide, completely dominating the global charts with its cinematic, history-infused lead single, Daechwita. But deeply buried within the heavy, intense track list was an aggressive, hard-hitting, and fiercely arrogant hip-hop anthem titled What Do You Think? That was about to unexpectedly detonate one of the most intensely painful, highly polarizing, and deeply toxic internal fandom crises in the entire recorded history of the ARMY fanbase. The massive controversy didn't stem from Yoongi's characteristically sharp, biting Korean lyrics, but rather from a very specific, deeply chilling, and highly obscure English audio sample that was deliberately placed at the very beginning of the track, a grainy, incredibly eerie vocal snippet that internet sleuths and deeply horrified international fans quickly identified as a direct, unfiltered sermon from Jim Jones, the incredibly notorious, deeply evil American cult leader who is historically responsible for the horrifying, deeply tragic 1978 Jonestown massacre, where over 900 innocent people were brutally manipulated into committing mass suicide. The absolute second this terrifying, deeply unsettling revelation hit the global timeline, the internet instantly exploded into a massive, uncontrollable digital wildfire, brutally and cleanly fracturing the deeply united fandom right down the middle and sparking an incredibly vicious, emotionally devastating civil war that saw millions of heavily stressed fans aggressively tearing each other apart across Twitter, Reddit, and massively populated fan forums. On one fiercely protective, incredibly vocal side of the digital trenches, a massive wave of intensely loyal defenders, hardcore hip-hop enthusiasts, and dedicated solo supporters aggressively rallied to Yoongi's defense, loudly and passionately arguing that the controversial sample was a brilliant, deeply intentional, and highly sophisticated artistic choice, deliberately designed to aggressively mock and belittle the toxic, cult-like mentality of the group's massive, obsessive anti-fans and the fiercely manipulative South Korean media landscape. They pointed to the rich, deeply rebellious history of global underground hip-hop, where artists routinely and unapologetically utilize incredibly dark, deeply provocative, and highly controversial historical audio clips to establish an eerie, intimidating, and anti-establishment atmosphere, fiercely arguing that August D was a raw, completely independent artist who shouldn't be heavily censored or brutally crucified for exploring incredibly dark, heavy themes in his own deeply personal, explicitly rated solo work. However, on the exact opposite, deeply agonizing side of this incredibly intense debate, thousands of deeply uncomfortable, highly vocal, and profoundly hurt fans, particularly Black armies and international listeners who were deeply familiar with the horrific generational trauma and sheer unadulterated evil of the Jonestown tragedy, were completely paralyzed by a profound, sickening sense of shock and deep, agonizing betrayal, passionately and desperately arguing that using
the actual voice of a mass murderer simply for a cool, edgy aesthetic in a pop rap song was incredibly tone-deaf, wildly insensitive, and fundamentally disrespectful to the hundreds of innocent, deeply marginalized victims who brutally lost their lives in the South American jungle. They forcefully pushed back against the fierce defenders, heavily emphasizing that there is a massive, incredibly distinct line between authentic artistic expression and unnecessary shock value trauma mining, sparking a massive, deeply agonizing internal reckoning about cultural sensitivity, the heavy, suffocating responsibilities of global platform power, and the deeply toxic, terrifying lengths to which a massive parasocial fandom will blindly go to completely absolve their favorite artists of any legitimate, highly deserved criticism. As the intensely toxic, bitterly divided debate violently spilled over from closed fan spaces onto major, incredibly vicious mainstream Korean media platforms and global news outlets, completely threatening to permanently derail the incredibly successful release, Big Hit Entertainment finally stepped in and released a highly controversial, intensely scrutinized corporate apology that somehow managed to pour even more explosive gasoline onto the already raging fire. The massive company officially claimed that the producers who actively worked on the track had completely ignorantly selected the audio sample, entirely without knowing its incredibly dark, deeply horrifying historical origins, and forcefully stated that Yoongi himself was completely unaware of the grave error, leading to the massive, unprecedented decision to completely scrub the controversial sample from existence and quietly upload a newly edited, heavily sanitized version of the song to all global streaming platforms. This corporate response instantly sparked an entirely new, incredibly intense wave of profound outrage and deep, agonizing suspicion from almost every single corner of the fractured fandom, as hardcore fans simply refused to believe that Min Yoongi, a notoriously perfectionist, fiercely independent, and incredibly meticulous musical genius who famously agonizes over every single microsecond and every tiny sonic detail of his self-produced tracks, could somehow be completely blindly ignorant of the very first, highly prominent audio clip on his own deeply personal song. The incredibly messy, heavily debated resolution left a permanent, deeply uncomfortable scar on the fandom's collective psyche, forcing millions of devoted fans to violently confront the incredibly harsh, deeply uncomfortable reality of their absolute, unyielding idols making genuine, highly offensive human mistakes, while simultaneously grappling with the massive, shadowy influence of a billion-dollar corporate machine desperately scrambling to protect its most valuable, untouchable assets at the potential cost of an artist's raw, authentic truth. Looking back at the intense, deeply agonizing madness of the "What do you think?" controversy, it remains a massively pivotal, profoundly sobering moment that completely shattered the pristine, flawless illusion of absolute fandom unity, violently reminding the entire world that even the most brilliant, universally respected artists are completely capable of stumbling blindly into the incredibly dark, deeply unforgiving territory of cultural insensitivity. As the dust finally settled on this incredibly painful, deeply polarizing era, and we continue to heavily blast the heavily sanitized, intensely aggressive beats of August D through our speakers today, we are forced to deeply reflect on the agonizing, highly uncomfortable questions that completely refuse to fade away in the deafening silence. Did Min Yoongi truly, genuinely make a profoundly careless, incredibly ignorant mistake that deeply hurt thousands of his most devoted fans? Or was he aggressively, unfairly thrown under the corporate bus by a massive, terrified company desperately trying to silence a massively brilliant, fiercely independent artist who simply dared to push the creative boundary just a little too close to the bleeding edge? And ultimately, in the fiercely sanitized, hyper-controlled world of global megastardom, can an artist ever truly fully embrace their dark, unapologetic, and completely unhinged underground roots, or are they forever agonizingly chained to the massive, suffocating expectations of a flawless, pristine, and perfectly harmless idol image?
Number 2. Jimin, the vocal distortion divide. Transport yourself back to the highly anticipated, incredibly feverish, and intensely electric spring of 2023, a monumental era when the massive global fandom was practically holding its collective breath, desperately waiting for the long-overdue official solo debut of BTS's mesmerizing lead vocalist, the undisputed contemporary dance king, and the ultimate global it boy, Park Jimin. For an entire, spectacularly successful decade, Jimin had completely captivated the entire globe and built an absolute, untouchable legacy on the solid foundation of his unbelievably angelic, deeply emotive, and soaring countertenor voice, a remarkably rare, crystalline vocal instrument that flawlessly delivered the hauntingly beautiful high notes in legendary tracks like Lie, the incredibly soft, romantic whispers of Serendipity, and the seductive Latin-infused perfection of Filter, essentially conditioning millions of adoring fans to expect a highly polished, vocally pristine, and beautifully melodic solo debut that would effortlessly highlight his naturally sweet, breathtakingly high register. However, when big hit music finally aggressively dropped the highly anticipated pre-release track Set Me Free Part 2 from his deeply personal, incredibly raw debut studio album Face, Jimin made a shockingly bold, aggressively experimental, and wildly unexpected artistic decision that instantly sent a massive, deafening shockwave through the entire internet and violently fractured the deeply united ARMY fandom into two incredibly vocal, fiercely debating camps. Instead of safely delivering the delicate, beautifully orchestrated pop ballad that absolutely everyone had confidently predicted, he completely shattered the fandom's comfortable, long-held expectations by unleashing a phenomenally aggressive, incredibly dark, and fiercely hip-hop-infused anthem backed by a massive, booming gospel choir. But the absolute, undeniable epicenter of the massive controversy wasn't the incredibly intense, hard-hitting choreography or the massive scale of the grandiose music video, but rather the shockingly heavy, highly stylized, and incredibly metallic vocal distortion and aggressive auto-tune that deliberately, heavily masked his world-famous, angelic singing voice for almost the entire duration of the explosive track. The absolute second the aggressive, brass-heavy beat dropped on global streaming platforms, the massive digital timeline instantly erupted into an incredibly chaotic, deeply emotional, and highly toxic civil war that saw millions of heavily stressed fans aggressively tearing each other apart over the true definition of vocal artistry and the incredibly controversial, heavily debated use of intense vocal processing in modern pop music. On one deeply disappointed, intensely critical, and highly vocal side of the digital barricades, a massive wave of traditional vocal purists, deeply concerned veteran fans, and highly critical casual listeners erupted into absolute blinding outrage, loudly and aggressively accusing the company's producers of completely ruining a highly anticipated masterpiece and blatantly disrespecting one of the greatest, most unique vocalists in the entire K-pop industry. They passionately and aggressively argued across endless, deeply heated Twitter spaces and massive global fan forums that heavily drowning Jimin's breathtaking, naturally gorgeous voice in a suffocating metallic sea of harsh robotic auto-tune was a catastrophic, completely unforgivable sonic crime, expressing a profound, deeply agonizing sense of betrayal and genuine confusion as they forcefully questioned why any competent producer
producer would ever deliberately choose to bury his absolute greatest, most beloved artistic asset behind thick, heavy layers of cheap, artificial-sounding digital manipulation, with some intensely toxic solo supporters even launching massive, highly aggressive online petitions demanding that Big Hit immediately release a raw, completely unedited and stripped-down acoustic version of the intense track to desperately save his deeply respected, hard-earned artistic reputation from being completely destroyed by the harsh, fiercely critical global media. However, on the exact opposite, fiercely protective and deeply analytical side of this incredibly tense, massive divide, an equally passionate, highly articulate, and fiercely loyal legion of progressive fans and deeply dedicated supporters aggressively rallied tightly behind Jimin, forcefully countering the overwhelming, deafening wave of harsh criticism by brilliantly unpacking the profound, incredibly dark, and deeply psychological thematic narrative that he was meticulously, brilliantly trying to convey through this highly experimental, deeply polarizing sonic choice. They loudly and proudly pointed out that Face was an incredibly intimate, painfully raw, and deeply vulnerable concept album that explicitly detailed his terrifying, deeply suffocating internal battles with severe depression, crippling anxiety, and intense self-doubt during the agonizing, incredibly isolating years of the global pandemic, and aggressively argued that the harsh, robotic, and heavily distorted auto-tune wasn't simply a lazy, cheap studio trick used to hide vocal imperfections, but rather a brilliant, incredibly deliberate, and profoundly theatrical artistic device intentionally designed to perfectly mirror the terrifying, suffocating feeling of being completely trapped inside his own mind, heavily burdened by the crushing, artificial pressures of massive global superstardom. They passionately emphasized that as the intense, deeply aggressive song violently progresses and reaches its massive, breathtaking climax, the harsh, metallic distortion beautifully, triumphantly fades away, powerfully culminating in a raw, staggering, and incredibly clear high note that perfectly, poetically symbolizes his ultimate triumphant liberation from his own dark, suffocating internal demons, brilliantly proving that the incredibly controversial vocal processing was actually a stunning, masterfully executed narrative tool rather than a massive, careless production blunder. The agonizing, completely chaotic friction between these two fiercely opposing ideologies reached an absolute thrilling fever pitch when Jimin finally took to the massive global stages, completely dominating domestic music shows and major American television broadcasts with shockingly intense, incredibly raw, and absolute masterclasses in live, unfiltered performance, perfectly executing the incredibly demanding, lung-busting choreography while simultaneously delivering flawlessly clear, stunningly powerful live vocals that instantly, completely silenced the vicious, heavily prejudiced critics who had falsely, maliciously accused him of relying on auto-tune to hide a declining vocal technique. This monumental, intensely polarizing decision wasn't just some simple, cheap gimmick or a desperate, poorly calculated attempt to chase a fleeting, aggressive Western hip-hop trend. It was a profound, deeply courageous, and fiercely unapologetic artistic metamorphosis, a deeply necessary, painful, and beautiful evolution for a fiercely independent artist who was desperately, passionately fighting to completely shed the suffocating, pristine, and perfectly harmless fairy image of his past, and definitively prove to the entire, highly judgmental world that he is a beautifully complex, incredibly resilient, and deeply multifaceted adult human being, entirely capable of violently confronting his darkest, most terrifying demons on massive global stages. Looking back at the absolute chaotic madness of the Set Me Free Part 2 controversy, it will forever be permanently cemented and deeply remembered as one of the most intensely debated, profoundly polarizing, yet brilliantly calculated, boldest artistic statements in his entire legendary career. A truly defining, watershed moment where Park Ji-min fearlessly gambled his universally adored, perfectly flawless, angelic vocal reputation for a highly intoxicating, incredibly profound taste of raw, unbridled, and deeply authentic artistic storytelling, effectively leaving a permanently deeply divided fandom in his massive chaotic wake, but ultimately triumphantly emerging from the suffocating metallic flames as an untouchable, fiercely independent, and legendary global pop titan who completely refuses to be caged, heavily sanitized, or defined by the nostalgic, deeply suffocating expectations of millions. As we deeply reflect on the incredible, undeniable brilliance of this intensely aggressive, heavily debated masterpiece and the absolute, untamed fire he brilliantly unleashed on the world, we are left intensely wondering and deeply questioning the real, unfiltered truth behind the glossy, hyper-controlled facade of the K-pop industry. How much intense, terrifying courage does it truly take for an artist to deliberately, intentionally distort their own universally beloved, greatest gift just to desperately force a heavily prejudiced, incredibly stubborn world to finally listen to the incredibly painful, deeply agonizing, and profoundly beautiful truth hidden deep within their soul? And are we, as a massive, deeply demanding fandom, ever truly ready to fully embrace the terrifying, incredibly messy, and deeply distorted reality of our flawless, perfect idols?
Number 1. The controversial Director Alliance. Bring your mind to the highly anticipated, incredibly tense, and utterly spectacular late summer of 2023, a massive, history-making moment when the entire global music industry was anxiously holding its collective breath for the final crowning jewel of BTS's fiercely debated Chapter 2 solo era, patiently waiting for the undeniably magnetic, globally adored Kim Tae-young, universally known as V, to finally unveil his highly guarded musical universe to the world. For an entire spectacularly successful decade, Tae-young had effortlessly completely captivated the entire globe and built an absolute untouchable legacy on the solid, breathtaking foundation of his incredibly rich, soulful baritone voice, his impossibly striking, museum-worthy visual aesthetics, and his notoriously deep, unyielding passion for vintage jazz, classic R&B, and old Hollywood romance, essentially conditioning millions of fiercely adoring fans to expect a grand, sweeping, and beautifully cinematic solo debut. However, when the deeply secretive promotional rollout for his highly anticipated debut studio album, Layover, finally began to surface, V made a shockingly bold, highly unexpected, and incredibly controversial corporate and artistic decision that instantly sent a massive, deafening shockwave through the entire internet and violently fractured the deeply united ARMY fandom into two incredibly vocal, fiercely debating, and highly stressed camps. Instead of safely working within the comfortable, deeply trusted, and historically proven walls of big hit music with legendary in-house producers like P-Dog or Slow Rabbit, or even collaborating with massive, guaranteed hit Western pop producers, Tae-young made the incredibly deliberate, fiercely independent, and highly unprecedented choice to personally reach out to and completely hand over the entire creative, musical, and visual direction of his deeply personal solo album to Min Hee-jin, the fiercely brilliant but incredibly polarizing, highly controversial CEO of the HYBE sublabel ADOR and the visionary mastermind behind the massive global phenomenon New Jeans.
The absolute second this massive, highly unexpected collaboration was officially announced, the massive digital timeline instantly erupted into an incredibly chaotic, deeply emotional, and highly toxic civil war that saw millions of heavily stressed fans aggressively tearing each other apart across endless Twitter spaces, massive global fan forums, and highly populated Reddit threads. On one deeply concerned, intensely protective, and highly vocal side of the digital barricades, a massive wave of veteran armies and incredibly fierce solo supporters erupted into absolute blinding outrage, loudly and aggressively expressing a profound, deeply agonizing sense of genuine fear and immense betrayal, because Min Hee-jin was a highly controversial figure within the fiercely competitive K-pop industry, having previously faced intense, highly publicized, and deeply disturbing accusations regarding her past creative concepts at SM Entertainment and her highly debated artistic choices that many critical fans fiercely argued inappropriately romanticized youth and heavily blurred the lines of acceptable idol aesthetics. These incredibly passionate, deeply worried fans violently argued that by deliberately aligning himself with such a massively polarizing, highly debated corporate figure, Taehyung was unnecessarily risking his pristine, universally respected, and completely untouchable global reputation, fiercely expressing their intense, deeply rooted anxiety that she would selfishly hijack his highly anticipated solo debut to heavily promote her own distinct, highly recognizable indie pop aesthetic, effectively stripping away his unique, deeply personal artistic identity and unfairly taking all the mainstream credit for his massive, guaranteed global success. However, on the exact opposite, fiercely supportive and deeply analytical side of this incredibly tense, massive divide, an equally passionate, highly articulate, and fiercely loyal legion of progressive fans aggressively rallied tightly behind Taehyung, forcefully countering the overwhelming, deafening wave of harsh criticism by brilliantly and aggressively pointing out that Kim Taehyung is a fully grown, incredibly intelligent, and fiercely independent 27-year-old artist with exquisitely specific, highly refined artistic tastes who knew exactly what he was doing when he actively sought out the absolute best visual director in the entire industry to perfectly execute his vintage, nostalgic vision. They loudly and proudly celebrated his immense, undeniable autonomy, passionately arguing that his incredibly bold decision to deliberately step outside of the suffocating, predictable big-hit formula and aggressively cross deeply entrenched, highly toxic corporate sub-label boundaries was an absolute masterclass in true artistic freedom, fiercely reminding the angry, boycotting fans that V's deeply romantic, soft, and slightly eccentric visual identity perfectly, beautifully aligned with the raw, lo-fi, and incredibly intimate analog aesthetic that Min Hee-jin was globally famous for flawlessly producing. The agonizing, completely chaotic friction between these two fiercely opposing ideologies reached an absolute, thrilling fever pitch when the breathtakingly beautiful, heavily debated album Layover finally dropped, completely shattering the massive, hyper-energetic, and incredibly demanding expectations of the modern mainstream K-pop industry by delivering a phenomenally brave, incredibly soft, and fiercely anti-pop masterpiece that completely lacked any heavy, lung-busting choreography, massive stadium-ready EDM beat drops, or highly viral, easily digestible TikTok dance challenges. Instead, Taehyung completely surrendered to his deeply old-school soul, delivering an incredibly lush, beautifully moody, and deeply relaxing collection of slow-burn R&B tracks and vintage jazz-infused melodies like Slow Dancing and Love Me Again, brilliantly accompanied by incredibly raw, beautifully unpolished music videos, and even boldly making the highly unconventional, deeply endearing choice to heavily feature his beloved pet Pomeranian Yentan as the official, massively celebrated mascot and album cover star. This incredibly soft, deeply romantic musical direction further fueled the intense, heavily debated fandom fire, because while millions of deeply enchanted fans completely swooned over the breathtakingly intimate, beautifully comforting, and incredibly authentic atmosphere of the record, the fiercely chart-obsessed, highly competitive faction of the fandom grew incredibly frustrated and deeply anxious, aggressively pointing out that slow, melancholic indie R&B tracks historically do not perform as well on the massive, heavily contested global streaming charts or mainstream Western radio, fiercely arguing that his incredibly stubborn, uncompromising artistic vision was actively, deliberately sabotaging his massive potential for massive, history-making Billboard domination. Yet Kim Tae-young stood completely unfazed, incredibly calm, and fiercely unapologetic amidst the massive, swirling storm of endless controversy and toxic chart demands, gracefully performing on intimate, softly lit stages with a beautifully relaxed, deeply happy smile, decisively proving that he absolutely did not care about chasing fleeting superficial viral trends or aggressively breaking massive, highly stressful commercial records, and that his ultimate, incredibly profound goal was simply to create a beautiful, timeless, and deeply healing piece of art that perfectly and honestly reflected the quiet, romantic depths of his own beautiful soul. Looking back at the absolute chaotic madness of the layover era and the fiercely debated Min-hee-jin collaboration, it will forever be permanently cemented and deeply remembered as one of the most intensely polarizing, profoundly courageous, and brilliantly defiant artistic statements in his entire legendary career. A truly defining, watershed moment where V fiercely gambled massive, guaranteed mainstream commercial dominance for a highly intoxicating, incredibly profound taste of raw, unbridled, and deeply authentic artistic satisfaction.